In early December 2018, the emergency room of a South Carolina hospital faced an impossible medical paradox. A 29-year-old woman arrived with catastrophic hemorrhaging. Doctors immediately recognized the trauma. Her body had just expelled a placenta. The physical evidence of a full-term delivery was undeniable. Yet, as medical staff frantically searched for an infant to stabilize, the bleeding woman calmly insisted she had never been pregnant, and there was no baby. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To the outside world, specifically the digital community that followed her every post, Alyssa Dayvault was a picture of modern motherhood. Living in the coastal community of North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, she projected an existence bathed in the flattering glow of ring lights. She was a beauty vlogger and makeup enthusiast. Her social media feeds were meticulously curated galleries of cosmetic tutorials and flawless selfies. Every image was filtered. Every physical imperfection was actively concealed beneath layers of high-end foundation and perfectly blended contour. She wasn't just selling makeup, she was selling a narrative. To her subscribers, friends, and her own mother, Alyssa was a dedicated parent to 2 young girls from a previous relationship. She flooded her online profiles with anecdotes of school runs and the relatable struggles of balancing a budding online brand with raising children. By all outward accounts, she was succeeding. She appeared deeply attached to her daughters. There were no whispers of neglect and no red flags raised by local teachers or pediatricians. In the daylight, she was functioning, sociable, and remarkably normal. This was the most disorienting aspect of her psychological profile for the investigators who would later dissect her life. Alyssa did not fit the typical pattern of a woman detached from reality. She possessed the organizational skills to maintain a digital content calendar, the social intelligence to build a loyal following, and the maternal track record of keeping 2 children healthy. She had already navigated pregnancy, childbirth, and the grueling early years of motherhood successfully, twice over. She knew exactly what it meant to bring a child into the world, and she was intimately familiar with prenatal medical care. But the internet is essentially an architecture of illusion. The same platforms that allowed Alyssa to broadcast her life also allowed her to ruthlessly crop out anything that didn't fit her chosen aesthetic. Behind the camera lens, the 29-year-old was constructing an impenetrable psychological fortress. While she spent her evenings actively engaging with followers and demonstrating the best techniques to highlight a cheekbone, a profound dissonance was taking root. Maintaining a beauty blog requires an obsessive focus on the physical form. Every angle and shifting shadow is scrutinized by the creator. Yet, Alyssa was somehow able to completely disassociate her mind from her own physical reality. The meticulous effort she put into her face stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the undeniable biological changes happening from the neck down. She began to compartmentalize her existence into 2 distinct realities. In one, she was the vibrant, engaged influencer. In the other, she was a woman harboring a physical secret that defied basic human logic. She learned to hide the signs of a full-term pregnancy from everyone in her coastal town. She strategically altered her daily wardrobe, relying heavily on oversized sweaters and baggy athletic wear. When the recording light was on, she strictly framed herself from the chest up. Her ability to deceive was not a sudden reaction born of panic. It was a practiced, sustained, and deeply entrenched behavior. For months on end, she looked her own daughters in the eye, went to her day job, filmed her videos, and interacted with her community, all while carrying a growing life that she had already mentally erased. The psychological endurance required to maintain this level of deception is staggering. It requires a total severing of the mind from the body. Alyssa had effectively built a daily routine entirely out of concealer, masking a methodical darkness that remained entirely invisible to the thousands of people watching her screen every single day. The domestic sphere is where the illusion should have inevitably fractured. It is one thing to deceive a digital audience on a glowing screen. It is entirely another to fool the man sharing your bed. Chris Metechen entered the picture as a grounding, stable force in a chaotic world. He was an ordinary, hardworking guy who bought wholeheartedly into the carefully constructed reality his girlfriend presented to the public. He integrated smoothly into the household, eagerly embracing the role of a surrogate father figure to her 2 young girls. To the outside observer and to Chris himself, they were building a solid, loving, blended family. They took vacations, they celebrated holidays, they occupied the exact same physical space, day in and day out, sharing the mundane intimacies of cohabitation. But beneath this veneer of suburban stability, a staggering psychological manipulation was taking place. When the physical signs of a new life began to manifest, the expected human reactions, panic, joy, or even a desperate plea for help, were completely bypassed. Instead, an absolute, impenetrable physiological firewall dropped over her mind. The deception she initiated required a relentless, daily execution of control that defies basic comprehension. Living in close quarters meant every single interaction was a potential minefield. She had to dictate the exact parameters of their shared existence to prevent the truth from slipping through the cracks. The logistics of hiding a growing abdomen from an intimate partner are highly complex, yet she mastered the dark art of physical diversion. She controlled the environment with militant precision. The lighting in their home was kept intentionally dim during the evenings. The bathroom door was always locked. Physical intimacy was strictly managed, dictated entirely on her terms, or avoided altogether under a perpetual guise of fatigue or vague illness. She learned to carry herself differently, altering her posture to minimize the outward curve of her spine, perfecting a casual, forward-leaning slouch when seated on the living room couch. If a shifting contour of her body was accidentally brushed against in the dark, she had a Rolodex of medical excuses prepared and rehearsed. She complained of severe gastrointestinal issues. She claimed to be suffering from complex hormonal imbalances that caused extreme, painful bloating. She weaponized his inherent trust against him. Because he loved her, he believed the medical anomalies she described. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that the woman casually cooking dinner in the kitchen, helping the kids with their homework, and chatting about their weekend plans was actively concealing a third trimester reality beneath her oversized shirts. This was not a passive secret. It was an active, exhausting campaign of daily gaslighting. If her partner expressed even a fraction of concern about her changing shape, her sudden weight gain, or sudden spells of nausea, she immediately pivoted to defensive irritation. She manufactured vulnerability, making him feel guilty for questioning her physical health or making her feel insecure about her body. She essentially trained him to look away. Over time, human beings adapt to their environments, and he adapted to her rigid boundaries. He saw the woman he wanted to marry, a dedicated mother dealing with frustrating but benign health issues. He did not see the horrific truth incubating just inches away from him. The most chilling aspect of this domestic theater was its endurance. This environment of total secrecy was not a brief lapse in judgment. It was sustained over years, serving as the blueprint for multiple concealed pregnancies. The mind recoils at the stamina required to maintain such a lie without breaking. Every morning, she woke up, looked her boyfriend in the eye, and poured coffee. Every evening, she washed her face, applied her serums, filmed her content, and went to sleep next to a man who had absolutely no idea who he was holding. The boundary between her curated fiction and her biological reality became absolute. She didn't just lie to her partner, she systematically erased the developing life from her own consciousness. To survive the extreme cognitive dissonance of her daily routine, she had to view the physical changes happening to her body as an abstract inconvenience rather than a human being. The house became a container for an invisible psychological pressure cooker. Outside, the South Carolina sun beat down on their quiet coastal neighborhood. Inside, a masterclass in sociopathic compartmentalization played out amidst the totally ordinary backdrop of laundry, grocery shopping, and evening television. The facade finally cracked in the early days of December. A biological clock does not negotiate with psychological denial. For months, the creator had successfully manipulated lighting, posture, and clothing to erase her physical reality. But the human body possesses a ruthless, undeniable agenda of its own. It started as a deep, rhythmic cramping, a sensation that could no longer be dismissed as gastrointestinal distress or a vague hormonal imbalance. This was the raw, unyielding force of labor. She retreated to the only space where her control remained absolute, the master bathroom. The lock clicked into place. She turned the shower dial to its maximum setting, allowing the heavy spray of hot water to drum against the fiberglass tub. The exhaust fan clicked on, adding a mechanical hum to the confined room. These were calculated layers of white noise, specifically designed to drown out any sound that might penetrate the thin drywall and alert anyone else in the house. Steam quickly filled the cramped space, fogging the mirrors where she had spent countless hours perfecting her online persona. Now, she was entirely alone, stripped of her filters and her audience, trapped in a humid, suffocating box with a reality she refused to acknowledge. The progression of unassisted labor is brutal. There were no monitors, no epidurals, and no medical staff to guide the process. The pain escalated from dull, rolling waves to blinding, all-consuming agony. Pacing shifted entirely. Her breathing grew shallow, erratic. She gripped the edges of the porcelain sink, the cold ceramic pressing into her palms as her internal musculature forcibly took over. Short, violent contractions racked her frame. The physical trauma of delivering a child in secret requires a terrifying suppression of instinct. She could not scream. She could not call for her partner just down the hall. Every agonizing push had to be executed in absolute suffocating silence. And then, it was over. A baby boy was born onto the bathroom floor. For a fraction of a second, the overwhelming machinery of her deception should have shattered. The physical presence of a newborn, the weight, the warmth, the undeniable humanity of the child, forces an immediate reckoning. But the psychological firewall held firm. She did not reach for a towel. She did not clear the infant's airway to help him breathe. She simply stared down at the devastating collapse of her months-long lie. Then, the extreme trauma of the unassisted birth caught up with her. Massive internal blood loss triggered a rapid, dangerous drop in blood pressure. The harsh fluorescent lights above the vanity began to strobe and fade from her vision. The edges of the room tunneled into deep darkness. She collapsed onto the wet, cold linoleum, her body slipping violently into unconsciousness. Time lost all meaning in that steam-filled room. When she finally regained awareness, the shower was still running. The bathroom was sweltering, the air heavy with moisture and the sharp, metallic scent of blood. She pushed herself up from the floor, her limbs trembling from deep physiological shock and extreme physical depletion. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the harsh overhead light. The newborn was still there. Medical records and subsequent investigations would later reveal a chilling forensic detail. The infant was born alive. He had a heartbeat. He drew breath. But in the immediate, hazy aftermath of her blackout, the mother made absolutely no attempt to assess the child's vitals. There was no desperate check for a pulse. There was no frantic attempt at resuscitation or basic care. Instead, the mind that had successfully compartmentalized a third trimester pregnancy executed its final, horrifying protocol. The baby was not a fragile life to be saved. It was biological evidence to be destroyed. She moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency that defies basic human comprehension. She located a standard, thin plastic garbage bag, the exact kind used for everyday household waste. The rustling of the plastic was sharp and deafening in the quiet room. She placed the newborn inside. She twisted the top and tied the plastic into a tight knot, sealing the bag completely. She unlocked the bathroom door. The house was dead quiet. The logistical precision of the act required a total suppression of panic. She carried the bag through her own home, walking past the spaces where her older daughters played, past the living room where she relaxed with her partner. Every step was a heavy, agonizing effort for a body that had just endured major trauma. She opened the front door and stepped out into the freezing December air. The biting coastal wind whipped across her face, a jarring contrast to the suffocating heat of the bathroom. She walked down the concrete driveway toward the large green municipal trash receptacle sitting on the curb. She lifted the heavy plastic lid. It creaked loudly on its hinges. She dropped the bag inside. The lid slammed shut with a hollow, echoing thud. It was a mundane, everyday sound, the exact same noise made by millions of suburban residents taking out the trash. No alarms sounded. The quiet neighborhood remained entirely undisturbed. She turned around and walked back into her house, shutting the front door on the unspeakable horror resting at the end of her driveway. She returned to the bathroom to systematically erase the biological crime scene. She scrubbed the linoleum. She cleaned the porcelain. She attempted to wash away the massive amounts of blood, relying on the same meticulous attention to detail she utilized when blending cosmetics for the camera. But the human body is not a digital canvas that can simply be wiped clean. Her internal trauma was catastrophic. The placenta had not delivered. The umbilical cord remained partially inside her, and the internal hemorrhaging was severe, rapid, and relentless. She was actively bleeding to death. Panic, real, undeniable physiological panic, finally broke through her psychological barrier. She could clean the floor tiles, but she could not stop the internal tearing. As the blood volume dropped, her cognitive function began to slip. She grew dizzy, dangerously pale, and incredibly weak. The reality of her impending death forced her hand. She had to seek medical attention. But even in the face of fatal hemorrhaging, the architecture of her lie remained perfectly intact. When emergency services were eventually contacted, and as she was rushed into the harsh, sterile lights of the hospital trauma bay, she clung to the fiction. She presented herself solely as a woman suffering from a sudden, inexplicable, and terrifying medical emergency. The ambulance ride was a blur of wailing sirens and urgent radio chatter. Paramedics worked frantically in the cramped back of the rig, struggling to establish intravenous lines in her collapsing veins. They pushed fluids desperately, trying to elevate a blood pressure reading that was plummeting toward a fatal threshold. The amount of blood she was losing was staggering, highly consistent with severe pelvic trauma or a ruptured organ. Yet her abdomen felt soft to the touch. Her medical history, as she relayed it through chattering teeth and a deep haze of shock, offered zero clinical clues. Upon bursting through the double doors of the emergency room, the trauma team descended. The bright overhead halogens illuminated the terrifying extent of her critical condition. Clothing was cut away. Heart monitors chirped in rapid, alarming sequences. Physicians shouted orders for immediate blood transfusions, ordering type O negative to be pushed instantly just to keep her heart pumping. The attending physician conducted a rapid physical exam, searching for the exact source of the hemorrhage. The assessment yielded an impossible, glaring finding: the dilation, the tearing, the undeniable, unmistakable physiological aftermath of a violent, unassisted delivery. The room froze. The medical team stared at the glowing monitors, then down at the patient, their years of clinical training violently colliding with the words coming out of her mouth. They asked the question with urgent, rising panic. They demanded to know where the child was. They needed to immediately dispatch a unit to recover a newborn that had to be freezing, vulnerable, and in desperate need of neonatal intensive care. Through lips pale from extreme exsanguination, she shook her head. Her pulse raced at a terrifying speed, the monitors screaming a constant warning of imminent cardiac failure, but her voice remained chillingly steady. She told the trauma surgeons, the frantic nurses, and the bewildered paramedics that they were entirely mistaken. She insisted, as her failing body expelled the remaining physical evidence of a full-term pregnancy directly onto the hospital gurney, that there was no baby. The lie was absolute, sustained even as she stared death in the face, leaving a room full of seasoned medical professionals trapped in a surreal, waking nightmare. The attending physicians did not have the luxury of entertaining a psychological delusion. A patient was actively bleeding out from a severed umbilical cord, yet she stared blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles and repeated her impossible narrative. The medical protocols for such an event are rigid and instantaneous. Hospital administrators immediately contacted the North Myrtle Beach Police Department. The dispatch call was frantic: a suspected concealed birth, a critically unstable mother, and an unaccounted-for newborn. The urgency was absolute. The coastal temperature had dropped significantly overnight. Every single minute that passed reduced the window of infant survivability to zero. Patrol officers and plainclothes detectives descended on the emergency department. Their first target was the obvious one. Chris Madison was pulled into a stark, windowless family consultation room. Investigators expected to corner a co-conspirator. They operated under the standard assumption that hiding a full-term pregnancy from a live-in partner was physically impossible. Therefore, he had to be involved in the child's disappearance. They hammered him with questions about the past 48 hours, demanding to know where the couple had disposed of the infant. Instead of a defensive suspect, detectives found a man completely paralyzed by a surreal, waking nightmare. Chris corroborated Alyssa's fabricated medical history down to the last detail. He recounted her complaints of severe bloating, her gastrointestinal issues, and her chronic fatigue. He provided a timeline of their evening that aligned perfectly with the mundane reality of a quiet suburban night. His shock was not rehearsed. It was the raw, unmitigated horror of a man realizing the foundation of his life was an elaborate fiction. This realization forced the investigation into a frustrating, immediate dead end. If the man sharing her mattress was oblivious, the detectives were navigating a level of sociopathic deception they rarely encountered. To break the psychological deadlock, investigators pivoted to digital and medical forensics. They needed irrefutable data to counter her relentless gaslighting. Subpoenas for her medical history were rushed through. The detectives expected to find a completely blank slate, but the truth was far more disturbing. They uncovered a fragmented, highly manipulated trail of clinical visits. There were isolated blood panels and vague emergency clinic visits for abdominal pain, yet she had masterfully avoided any continuous prenatal care that would officially document a fetus. She had navigated the healthcare system with the exact same calculated framing she used on her beauty blog, showing only what she wanted the professionals to see. The detectives found themselves staring at a void. They possessed physical proof of a delivery, but her official records provided zero leverage. The interrogation strategy shifted from investigative to forensic confrontation. 2 seasoned detectives entered her recovery room. The environment was oppressively clinical. The rhythmic, synthetic chirp of the cardiac monitor, the sharp scent of iodine, the heavy hum of the HVAC system. Alyssa was pale, tethered to IV lines, pushing packed red blood cells into her depleted veins. They did not raise their voices. They did not hurl accusations. Instead, they placed the cold, immovable weight of human biology at the foot of her hospital bed. They calmly explained the physiological impossibility of her claims. A placenta had been surgically recovered from her body. The tearing and cervical dilation were documented by board-certified trauma surgeons. The narrative of a spontaneous, inexplicable hemorrhage was clinically dead. They needed to know where the child was. For grueling hours, the standoff continued. She offered slight variations of her initial denial, attempting to weave new, desperate excuses into the unyielding facts. But the physical toll of extreme exsanguination is impossible to ignore. Her body was failing, and the relentless logical pressure from the detectives began to fracture the architecture she had spent the better part of a year building. The carefully curated influencer persona finally collapsed against the sterile hospital pillows. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. When her voice finally broke, it dropped to a hollow, emotionless whisper. She admitted that a child existed. The narrative she provided was devoid of any maternal warmth or panicked remorse. She outlined the solitary labor in the master bathroom in chillingly clinical terms. She detailed the sudden delivery onto the wet linoleum and her subsequent loss of consciousness. The detectives pressed her, their pens hovering over their notepads, demanding the current location of the infant. They were still operating under a rescue mandate, hoping the child had been left at a fire station, a church, or with a desperate acquaintance. She looked at the detectives and offered a flat, procedural description of her actions. She stated she had placed the newborn boy into a standard, thin plastic garbage bag. She tied the plastic securely into a knot. She then carried the sealed bag out of her front door, walked down her concrete driveway, and dropped it into the green municipal waste bin sitting on the curb. The atmosphere in the recovery room instantly plummeted. The mandate shifted in a fraction of a second. This was no longer a frantic search and rescue mission for a vulnerable infant. It was a grim, localized recovery operation. Detectives immediately grabbed their radios, dispatching crime scene units directly to her quiet suburban address. The sun was just beginning to rise over the South Carolina coastline, casting long, pale shadows across the manicured lawns of her neighborhood, as police cruisers silently converged on the plastic trash receptacle at the edge of her property. The quiet, manicured streets of North Myrtle Beach woke to a jarring disruption. It was a standard, crisp December morning, the coastal air damp and heavy with salt. Commuters stepping out of their front doors were greeted not by the usual hum of suburban life, but by a sprawling grid of bright yellow crime scene tape. Unmarked cruisers and forensic vans choked the asphalt. The focus of the heavy police presence was entirely localized on a single mundane object, the dark green municipal waste bin resting at the edge of the driveway. Technicians clad in sterile white Tyvek suits approached the plastic receptacle. The lid was lifted. Inside, wedged among discarded cardboard packaging, food wrappers, and everyday domestic refuse, was the Tide plastic garbage bag. It was carefully extracted, placed on a sterile tarp, and opened. The contents instantly validated the grim confession secured in the hospital recovery room. The infant boy was documented, photographed in the harsh morning light, and transported to the county medical examiner's office. Word spreads with vicious speed in a tight-knit coastal community. The initial neighborhood rumors were chaotic, attempting to rationalize the presence of biohazard teams on the lawn of a familiar, seemingly friendly face. But when the truth began to leak through the very digital networks, the suspect so heavily relied upon, the community reaction was not merely shock. It was a profound, visceral revulsion. People who had actively consumed her cosmetic tutorials, neighbors who had stood next to her at school drop-offs, and parents who had hosted her daughters for playdates felt a deep psychological betrayal. The horror lay entirely in the absolute normalcy she had projected. The neighborhood felt permanently tainted. The glowing screen that separated her curated digital life from reality had been shattered, revealing a calculating pathology operating in plain sight. Her online platforms, once carefully managed galleries of aesthetic perfection, instantly transformed into macabre digital crime scenes. Thousands of comments flooded her old photos, a digital mob expressing the sheer terror of her former audience. Back at the precinct, seasoned investigators were unwilling to simply close the file on a single confession. The stark mechanics of her actions, the complete suppression of panic, the methodical, unhesitating disposal protocol, suggested a level of psychological detachment that rarely manifests in a vacuum. A mind does not typically execute such a flawless compartmentalization on its first attempt. Detectives initiated a massive, exhaustive dive into her digital footprint and medical history, spanning several years. The investigative process immediately hit a wall of bureaucratic frustration. Detectives spent grueling days wading through hundreds of thousands of text messages, social media posts, and fragmented clinical notes. They hit dead ends, trying to trace her physical movements through a labyrinth of online content. She had a long, documented history of vague, overlapping medical complaints. There were frequent, brief visits to urgent care facilities for severe cramping, sudden weight fluctuations, and unexplained bouts of anemia. Investigators chased down dozens of minor leads, interviewing former co-workers, distant relatives, and casual acquaintances. They searched for anyone who might have noticed a prior pregnancy or a sudden change in her physical dimensions. Chris Metechen was aggressively re-interviewed, his entire relationship timeline scrutinized for any microscopic cracks. Yet, his genuine, profound ignorance held up against every interrogation tactic. The detectives found themselves staring at a mountain of digital content that served as a highly effective, impenetrable smokescreen. They were looking at years of smiling selfies, completely unable to penetrate the dark spaces between the posts. The critical breakthrough arrived weeks later, courtesy of a meticulous cross-reference between her content calendar and an obscure set of medical billing codes. A sharp-eyed forensic analyst noticed a subtle 3-week gap in her online posting schedule occurring late in the previous year. She had cited a severe bout of the flu to her followers, abruptly logging off. Simultaneously, insurance records indicated a brief, uncharacteristic visit to a local clinic for severe pelvic pain and heavy bleeding, a visit she had quickly terminated against medical advice. Armed with this glaring anomaly, lead detectives returned to the interrogation room. The suspect had physically stabilized. Her complexion was no longer a ghostly white, but her psychological state remained an impenetrable, flat void. The room was oppressively silent, save for the hum of the overhead HVAC unit. The detectives laid the specific clinic paperwork face up on the metal table. They did not ask a single question about the infant boy recovered from her driveway. Instead, they demanded a minute-by-minute accounting of November 2017. The shift in her demeanor was microscopic, yet deeply telling. A slight hesitation, a prolonged break in eye contact. The investigators applied relentless pressure to the fracture. They methodically dismantled the flu excuse, cornering her with the medical billing and the absolute impossibility of her timeline. The resistance crumbled with disturbing ease. There was no emotional breakdown, no tearful plea for forgiveness, and no display of maternal grief. The flat, clinical tone she utilized in the hospital simply returned. She calmly admitted that the horrific events of December 2018 were not an isolated incident. 13 months earlier, she had executed the exact same protocol. The details she provided were a carbon copy of the current nightmare. In early November 2017, she had gone into secret, unassisted labor inside her residence. She delivered a baby girl into a bathroom toilet. She claimed she immediately passed out from the excruciating pain and rapid blood loss. When she regained consciousness, she noted the infant was unresponsive and no longer breathing, a convenient claim that investigators viewed with extreme skepticism given her established history of pathological deception. She followed the exact same disposal methodology. She located a plastic waste bag. She placed the newborn girl inside, tied the knot, and discarded the remains in a residential trash bin. But unlike the recent case, the municipal waste management system had operated on its normal schedule. The bin was emptied. The contents were transferred to a commercial compactor, crushed and permanently lost within the sprawling, toxic infrastructure of the county landfill. Detectives sat in the windowless interrogation room, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the darkness sitting across the table. She had successfully carried, delivered, and discarded a human being, seamlessly returning to her life and her beauty blog without a single person noticing. She had felt so secure in her deception, so completely detached from the reality of her actions, that she simply repeated the exact same atrocity a year later. The legal machinery. Ground forward, culminating in October 2020. As the trial for 2 counts of homicide by child abuse was set to begin at the Horry County Courthouse, the defendant made one final desperate attempt to control her narrative. She vanished. She refused to appear for jury selection, effectively severing her remaining ties to society and abandoning her older daughters permanently. The presiding judge refused to halt the proceedings. In a highly unusual maneuver, the trial went on in absentia. The prosecution presented the horrific medical records, the digital timelines, and the videotaped confessions to an empty defendant's chair. The jury required less than 2 hours of deliberation to return a guilty verdict on all charges. Her fugitive status was short-lived. Just hours after the conviction was broadcast across local media networks, the disgraced creator walked into a police precinct and surrendered without offering a defense. She was immediately transported back to the courtroom for sentencing. The judge handed down a decisive mandate: 40 years in a state penitentiary without the possibility of parole. The terrifying legacy of this case isn't just the sheer brutality of the acts themselves. It is the chilling realization of how easily human monsters can hide behind a digital ring light. We are conditioned to search the dark alleys and quiet woods for danger, but sometimes the abyss is looking right back at us through a perfectly filtered screen. The camera turns off, the makeup wipes away, and what remains in the quiet dark of a suburban bathroom is a horror we can never truly unsee. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.